All right, so today we are going to continue our deep dive into Market Basket and what is going on with this beloved New England supermarket chain. And joining me today again is Grant Welker from the Boston Business Journal, who has covered this supermarket extensively throughout his reporting career. And we're going to talk about some of the family dynamics that are shaping what's happening today as people wonder what is going to happen with Arthur T. after he was put on leave last week. And Grant, you just put out a story this morning, Friday, about more than 100 years of history of this supermarket and how it started and how these family dynamics over the past century are still shaping what we're seeing pan out today. So thanks for joining us again, Grant. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, because this is a family business still to this day, with roots from the immigrant community up in Lowell over 100 years ago. So first of all, tell me how Market Basket started.
Yep. And Market Basket was a great family story long before it became a little bit of a drama in more recent decades, and especially in the last week, and then back in 2014 especially. Market Basket is well into its third generation, nearing a fourth generation. It got its start in 1917 by Arthur T. Demoulas' grandfather. Arthur T., of course, for those who don't know, being the CEO. He was a Greek immigrant who came to Lowell and decided to open a small grocery store in downtown Lowell, which back then and still today is a huge immigrant population. And it was, as many would expect, nothing on the scale of what it is today. It was tailored to the Greek community in particular. Fresh lamb was one of their specialties. And from the start, the initial Arthur Demoulas was known for that strong customer service. Of course, any family business or any business at all would say they have strong customer service, but they did it in a way that really set up this long run for success that they've had, both in Lowell initially and now spanning 4 states across New England.
So they opened this small market. It's geared toward the Greek community in Lowell. This was in the early 20th century. I mean, walk me through how they made it through the Great Depression, because I know that was a very pivotal time for this family and for this company. And then it looks like things really started taking off for them in the 1950s. So kind of walk me through how it morphed into what we know it as today.
That's right. Yeah. Market Basket remained small for the first 20, 30 years of its existence, the first couple decades. It wasn't until that initial Arthur's sons, Telemachus and George Demoulas. Telemachus was known as Mike. That's Arthur T.'s dad. They helped lead it out of those early financial struggles related to the Depression and helped expand it into what ended up slowly becoming a regional market. And that started in the 1950s when they started incorporating what was then the latest technology, was the SKUs or the barcodes that help grocery stores go from these little mom and pop operations, more almost like a general store, and into something resembling what we see today. So that initial grocery store, the market in Lowell starts to expand. And then in the 1950s, it starts to go out across the Merrimack Valley into the North Shore, into New Hampshire, and stayed true in a lot of ways to what they initially wanted to be, letting customers buy on credit, which is something very unusual at that time, and not growing too fast. That's something that back then and through to today, it's not like Market Basket would say, okay, we're going to open 5 or 10 new stores in the coming year, whatever the case may be. It's more about picking and choosing, does this site work for a Market Basket? And if it does, they expand in that way. And it's been that way since that second generation.
So up until this point, this is still known as the Demoulas market, right? It's not Market Basket quite yet. That name change happened in the 1970s. So tell me a little bit about the circumstances around that name change and what happened then, because I know that was another point where things really started to change for this company.
It did, and I always love that people still call it Demoulas, even with Market Basket. It was part of branching out, and it was even in some cases some would be called Demoulas and some would still be called Market Basket. I forget. It was fairly recently in the scheme of things that there was still some with the Demoulas name. But what happened in that case in the 70s, things started changing with, as I said before, it was the two brothers who ran Market Basket together. It was Mike and it was George. George is Arthur T's uncle. He is the father of Arthur S. Demoulas. For people who don't know, or maybe might not remember, and it's a lot to keep track of, there is Arthur T., who is the CEO, Arthur S., who has not worked for the company, but until the last 10 years or so has been a prominent shareholder and sometimes a director. They both were named after their grandfather, and that creates a little bit of that confusion today. But it was in 1971 when George Demoulas died of a heart attack while vacationing in Greece. And that ended what had been a peaceful time. Up until then, it had gone, at least outwardly, very smoothly, and with people getting along, and the two brothers were close. They had even signed one another's wills that in the case of one dying, the other would take care of the other one's family. But that changed. There was a big twist in the story when George died in 1971.
So George,
and I can get foreshadowing it.
So George is Arthur S.'s dad.
That's
and
right.
Mike is Arthur T's dad.
It's a lot to keep track of. But that's
I know
right.
a lot of Arthurs. Yeah. So that tension is still kind of what we're seeing today. It sounds like. So, like you said, it was peaceful. Things seemed to be working up until this point, and then another point came in the 90s where we saw the first lawsuit happen in this family.
Yep, and it all stems back to that death of George Demoulas. So we'll go back to the 70s. George has passed away. Mike, his brother, continues to run the company. He's taking care of George's family. And it wasn't until 2 decades or so later that Arthur S. Demoulas and his brother Evan discovered that the 50-50 split that they once enjoyed was not remotely balanced like that. They had actually less than 10% of the company's shares. What had happened, what was alleged, and what was proven out in court after very public and very long and expensive lawsuits, was that Mike Demoulas had defrauded his late brother's heirs of their sides of the company. So that means they not only didn't have much for voting power, they didn't have much for profit sharing and such, and of course there would be bad blood if you think of one family member doing that to relatives. It completely changed the direction of the company. And the Arthur S. side, they won that court case, and they were given 50.5%, the very slightest majority of Market Basket. And there's another twist. There's another premature death. I'm foreshadowing again. That also means it wasn't quite so simple, and there was more drama to come.
And that death was
Evan. Arthur Demoulas. Yes, Evan Demoulas, Arthur S.'s brother. So it was 1993. Evan Demoulas was an investor and a race car driver. He was not involved directly in the company, but he lived what appeared to be a glamorous life, racing around Europe, died in a car crash, and his widow inherited his small share, believed to be about 4%. For reasons that were not made public, she decided she would vote not with her late brother's side of the family, with the Arthur S. side, but with the Arthur T. side. So despite, I'm getting into all the Arthurs again, despite getting the slight majority control after those lawsuits, the Arthur S. side did not enjoy the majority control. That went with Arthur T. But that changed in 2013, some way and somehow that widow changed her mind, decided she would vote with the Arthur S. side again. And once that majority control changed, knowing how much bad blood was in this family, Arthur T could see the writing on the wall. A lot of his supporters and employees and executives could as well. Those lawsuits in the 90s got so heated that at one point Arthur T punched his cousin. He punched Arthur S. There was so many headlines back then of Market Basket being dysfunctional. It was kind of a preview of what was to come back in 2013 and 14. And yes, it turned what was a great family business story into one that's still a great family business story in terms of how successful they are and how much they've grown, but has also made it into a drama that people now are comparing to like Succession or the Gucci family and others that are so dramatic that they're even made into movies.
So in the meantime, Arthur T's dad dies. He dies in 2003, and then Arthur T really gets involved as CEO in 2008. I read that you wrote.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, how did this get to the point where he was fired in 2013 or in 2014, I should say? Mm-hmm. What led to that decision for firing Arthur T? Like, how is he doing as CEO during those first few years of his tenure?
As CEO, strictly in terms of running the business financially and growing the business, he was doing great. There wasn't much dispute of that. The company had grown to 70 or so locations at that point in 2013 and had surpassed $4 billion in sales. It had done great for the community in terms of supporting nonprofits across Merrimack Valley and beyond. But there was another side to that that had remained private in that otherwise quiet period between the 90s and those lawsuits, and then in 2013 and 2014. Arthur T, for all his success, did not often get along well with the board of directors. At one point, one of the directors was Arthur S. And again, I'm going to allude to the bad blood. They did not get along well. He did not always get along well with other directors who were affiliated with Arthur S. And board members were fighting with each other. That's a story that we had recently. Those board meeting minutes are not usually public. They became public through a lawsuit, and so we were able to get a window into that, be a fly on the wall. And what the board had alleged, take the bad blood out of it, take the emotion out of it, but the board had alleged that Arthur T was running the business without seeking the input or the cooperation of the board. He was running it as if he didn't have a boss, the boss or bosses being the directors. And he was signing new leases or buying properties for new stores. He was paying out bonuses and profit sharing to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a year. And he would tell the board afterwards. That was the source of another disagreement. And they wanted to remove him and bring in outsiders. They did. He was not fired in 2013 when that widow changed her mind and ended up voting with the Arthur S. side. It came a year later, but it was foreshadowed in some ways because you had them hire an outside executive search firm. So people were thinking, why would you hire an executive search firm if you're not replacing Arthur T? They paid a $300 million special dividend to themselves, the dividend going to shareholders, and the shareholders was the family. And when Arthur T was faced with some of those allegations about how he was dealing with the board and how he was running the company, he didn't dispute that there was disagreements, that there was tension, acrimony on the board, but he talked about how well the company had done. And again, there's no arguing with that, both in terms of looking at the financials and looking at how beloved the company is for employees and shoppers alike.
So we did a quick episode conversation earlier this week, you and I, and, we talked about what might happen this time, now that he's on a paid leave from this company. And I posted a clip on social media, and it was so interesting for me because I'll admit I was not aware of all this rigmarole before kind of getting involved in this storyline with you. And even though I'm from New England, my mom used to shop at Market Basket when I was a kid, and I remember going there. But I didn't realize how much of a figure Arthur T is to the community and to employees, because so many people were commenting on the TikTok and the Instagram that they remember boycotting the store in 2014, and they remember the walkouts, and they remember this, and a lot of people said that they would be willing to do that whole thing again to this day. So how did he become this persona to people? When did that happen, and how did that happen?
The Demoulas name does have that long time connection. Again, going back more than a century. Arthur T has spent essentially his entire life with the company, but only CEO since 2008. And so when this came up in 2013 and 2014, he wasn't there for so long in that role. But he has a knack for going into these dozens of locations. They have more than 30,000 employees now. It was 30 or 20,000 plus at the time. This knack for being very genuine and remembering people. Like I talked to so many employees who felt like he remembered details about them, or he had a way of asking about their personal lives, what they're studying in school, about their kids. He might remember that someone has a son that loves t-ball or a daughter who loves to dance. Uncanny that he could do this for so many employees. And he has a very kind of un-CEO like way about him, his characteristics, his personal, just his way of speaking, that I think ingratiates him to people. They feel like he's their pal in some ways, that he really is looking out for them. Think of how unlikely it is. Take a step back to think of a wealthy CEO who's running a multi-billion-dollar company, how hard it is for that person to appear relatable and so likable, lovable to people. And Arthur T was and is that person. It's think of how many companies that are even so closely associated with the Boston area or New England. How many people know who that CEO is? Think of Dunkin'. That's got to be as associated with Boston as any other company. Who can name the CEO? Who necessarily cares who the CEO is, as long as they get their coffee or their donuts? But in Market Basket's case, they feel like it's so connected to Arthur T in particular, but also to the Demoulas family. It's not just the fact that it used to be called Demoulas as a company. They feel like there's that real family connection. That's something that you might see elsewhere with a small store or maybe a chain with a small number of locations. Market Basket has more than 90 locations, and yet they still have this feel that is nearly impossible to replicate anywhere else, or else other companies would do it. Market Basket has been able to do it.
You know, the people that I was seeing comment, it seemed to me that they just felt seen by him. And I think that's really important in any sort of, connecting with people, like making people feel seen and heard. I was reading people commenting on how he would go to stores and ask them how their work was going and if there's things that could be done to make their work easier or better. Someone mentioned that he went to a wake of either an employee or a loved one of an employee. So yeah, it does seem like he really just made people feel valued. And to that end, it seems like people that may have paid off for him big time in 2014, because tell me what happened after he was fired then.
Right. I'll get to that, but you're reminding me of another great anecdote to mention. There was a case where one of Market Basket's store directors, one of his young daughters, was in a very serious accident. It wasn't an accident, it was a brain injury. And Arthur T got involved in the case of, he would call the director and ask how his daughter was doing. At one point, he said, asked a question that became kind of infamous. He said, "Do we have to move her?" In other words, he was taking the time and the attention and the care to ask if he could do something to bring that daughter to a more capable hospital, for example. And so that became a story that was well told that summer, of that sense of do we have to move her? despite having, again, so many employees, he would take the time to, yes, to go to a wake or to check in on someone's family member who needed the attention. And that's what led to what we saw in 2014. Watching it, you could think, how is this ever going to work? There had been no precedent for a CEO being fired and then people, the whole community seemingly, employees and shoppers and vendors and others, rallying around that person and getting him back into that position. Watching it, what changed everything, what made it go from this is about impossible to I think this is really going to work, and then eventually how could this not work, is when shoppers got involved. It's one thing for employees to say, I love my CEO, he's the best. But for shoppers to know Arthur T's name, to know the Demoulas family, and for them to say, out of solidarity, I am not going to shop at Market Basket, I'm going to pay more at Stop and Shop or Shaw's or Hannaford or Target or you name it. And when they did that, they did so virtually unanimously. More than 90% of Market Basket's revenue disappeared. And it was, again, at the risk of using the word unprecedented too much, it was something where nobody could ever point to a case where not just employees but shoppers said, Market Basket won't be the same without Arthur T. And if it's not the same Market Basket, we don't want to shop there. They felt like they would do virtually anything in their power to get him back. So again, it's shoppers going elsewhere, paying more money. It's employees walking off the job and saying that if Market Basket were to become like any other, they didn't want to work there anyway. People, in some cases, putting their livelihoods on the line. In other cases, deciding to pay more money and do that. It was so improbable. And the fact that it worked over the span of that summer of 2014 is still hard to believe.
How long did that last? And did you say 90% of their revenue?
It was
lost?
More than 90. Yeah. So you can imagine and it lasted 6 weeks or so. You can imagine where, even though we don't know Market Basket's financials, we could all assume that at some point they're going to be close to insolvent. You can only have so much money in savings to last that long. Going to a Market Basket that summer, I made sure to go around and visit a bunch just to see what it was like. You would look at an empty parking lot and think that it must be like a major holiday where the stores are closed. You'd go inside and there'd be almost nobody there. The music would sort of like echo because it seemed so loud. There was no buzz from everybody moving about. It was so unusual, and it made for really jarring scenes. You had those empty stores, but then you go out to these rallies and there'd be sometimes thousands of people there. It was kind of like a circus atmosphere and nothing like it.
So, okay. So he's reinstated, it seems like the past 10 or so years since that all happened, they've continued to have a lot of success and growth in their company. I want to hear about let's bring it back to today a little bit. What we talked about, went over 100 years. Thank you for the history lesson. What all that tells us about how this latest situation of Arthur T being put on this administrative leave, we don't really know what's going to come next in terms of, any sort of public outcry, in terms of next steps, in terms of his employment. We don't know what's going to happen. Do these past events give us any clue as to how this might pan out in terms of all of the above?
It does in some ways, because you can see how successful Market Basket has been, how much it's given to the family, both in terms of those intangibles, how beloved the company is, but also financially. It's made the family so well off, so wealthy. And as family businesses go from one generation to the next, there are often these challenges of, if you're going to have a family member be a CEO or be in succession to be that CEO, it's a very difficult process to keep the emotion out of it and find who is best for that next role. And in Market Basket's case, Arthur T's two of his children are in Arthur T's eyes, best to take over for him. Others disagree. Family business experts I've talked to have said it's such a fraught situation to try to bring someone else in, because it may be someone who's not best suited for the job. As Market Basket is these days, with 90 stores, with more than $7 billion in revenue, that's a huge corporation to manage. And the best person to do it may not be Arthur T's children. It may not be another family member's children. It may be a case where after 3 generations with a Demoulas family, with a family member running the business, maybe it's in the best interest of the companies to look outside the Demoulas family and find someone else. A situation like with Walmart, where the Walton family still owns so much of Walmart, but they have stepped away themselves in executive roles, and they have brought in an outside executive to run the business and continue to grow. It's been so successful. The Demoulas family is faced with this conundrum of, can we or should we continue to have this in-house? Or is it time to take that emotion out of it and realize that the family members and the business itself may be better off in the shorter term, but especially in the long term, if they say it's best for all of us if we find another path forward?
Do you see, if this were to, leave the Demoulas family in terms of running this thing hands-on, what do you see for the future of Market Basket? I mean, it's kind of just a New England thing right now. Do you see it trying to go nationwide? Do you see things changing in terms of what it's known for pricing and things like that? I mean, what do you think would change?
And that's something where the Demoulas family would have to make that clear to a CEO, if it was an outside executive, that this is what their priorities are and this is what they want to get out of the business. Arthur T and his siblings have traditionally not wanted to maximize shareholder returns. That's something that the Arthur S side of the family did want. That's what a lot of family businesses do want, or public businesses and others for that matter. If the Demoulas family is able to bring in an executive who shares those values and knows those values because the family has made it clear, I don't think much would change. I don't expect Market Basket to suddenly go national. They've always grown organically, not through acquiring other firms or other businesses. And I think they would be well received if it was someone who, let's say, at least in the popular imagine, was the rightful heir to Arthur T and taking over his position. If that person is of a like mind to the Demoulases and to what Market Basket has been, I can see the family business continuing on. What was so worrying to people in 2013 and 2014 is that the Arthur S version of what they wanted the business to be, maximizing shareholder profits, would have become the norm, and Market Basket could have just become like any other business as they saw it. Maybe it would have been sold to a private equity firm that would have milked it for all of its profits. In this case, the Arthur S side is no longer in the picture. There is that ability to come to a consensus if they want to find a way forward that it's still Market Basket and it's still run in a similar way, but just not by a family member.
All right. Well, a lot to watch, Grant. Oh, man, there's a lot there. Well, thanks for, again, that history lesson on Market Basket and everything that's led up to this. I know that a lot of people are really watching this situation closely to see what happens over the coming weeks and to see what happens with Arthur T. By the way, how old is he now?
70.
He's 70 years old.
Yes.
So well, yeah, because I mean, that's a big part of this is that they claim that he was doing some sort of succession plan without really running it by the board. And Arthur S is not involved in anymore?
Nope. He was bought out back in 2014 when, and I should say too, to bounce back just very quickly to 2014, Arthur T was not restored to CEO by Arthur S. And that side, he bought out that side of the family and restored himself to CEO. But that side is out of the picture. That's what made it so unlikely to become something in the headlines again, is that now it's not a war between cousins. It's a war, if I can use that word, between siblings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Between Arthur T and his three sisters and the directors who represent them.
Right. Okay. Well, Grant, I don't think this is going to be the last time we talk. In fact, I hope we can touch base next week on some more of this and just, really looking at what is going on here, because I know a lot of people are watching this closely, like I said. So thank you for your know-how and for your following of this. And thanks for your time this morning speaking with us and catching us up on the Demoulas family and Market Basket.
I'm glad to do it. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good, Grant. Thanks so much.